call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 35 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Pursuant to Standing Order 108 sub 3, the committee is meeting to begin its clause-by-clause study of Bill C-25, an act to amend the Canada Elections Act, and to enact an act to change the name of certain electoral districts 2026. Today's meeting is taking place in public in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Before I continue, I'd ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, especially our interpreters. I'd like to remind witnesses that committee members may ask questions in either French or English. If you need interpretation, please take a moment now to prepare your earpiece and select the listening channel you need in advance in order to take full advantage of the time allotted for questions and answers. I'd like to make a few comments. A reminder that all comments should be addressed to the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, also use the raise hand function. We will do our best to manage the speaking order. I would like to provide members of the committee with a few comments on how committee will proceed with the clause-by-clause consideration of this bill. This is an examination of all clauses in order in which they appear in the bill. I will call each clause successively, and each clause is subject to a debate and vote. If there are amendments to the clause in question, I will recognize the member proposing it, who may explain it. The amendment will then be open for debate. When no further members wish to intervene, the amendment will be voted on. Amendments will be considered in the order in which they appear in the package each member received from the clerk. Amendments have been given a number in the top right corner to indicate which parties submitted them. During debate on an amendment, members are permitted to move sub-amendments. In addition to having to be properly drafted in a legal sense, amendments must also be procedurally admissible. The chair may be called upon to rule amendments inadmissible if they go against the principle of the bill or beyond the scope of the bill, both of which were adopted by the House when it agreed to the bill at second reading, or if they offend the financial prerogative of the Crown. If you wish to eliminate a clause of the bill altogether, the proper course of action is to vote against that clause when the time comes, not to propose an amendment to delete it. Once every clause has been voted on, the committee will vote on the title of the bill itself, and an order to reprint the bill may be required if amendments are adopted, so that the House has a proper copy for use at report stage. Finally, the committee will have to order the chair to report the bill to the House. That report contains only the text of any adopted amendments, as well as any indication of deleted clauses. I thank members in advance for their attention and wish everyone a productive clause by clause. Please have patience in your chair. This is the first time I'm doing it from the front of the room. I've done it many times from the side of the room, but I expect we will all get through this. I'd like to welcome officials who are joining us here today. From the Office of the Chief Electoral Officer, we have Carolyn Savard, General Counsel and Senior Director, Legal Services, Trevor Knight, General Counsel, Legal Services. From the Office of the Commissioner of Canada Elections, Chantal Richard, Executive Director and Senior General Counsel, Legal Services. Jean-Michel Kalubiaka, Senior Counsel and Director, Legal Services. And from the Privy Council Office, Rachel Pereira, Director, Democratic Institutions. Okay. So we will proceed. Pursuant to Standing Order 75 sub 1, consideration of Clause 1, the short title is postponed. The chair calls Clause 2. There are no... Shall Clause 2 carry? Agreed? Agreed. And carried. There is a new clause, 2.1, from Green Parti Vert. Ms. May, if you'd like to introduce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I need to put on the record on every occasion in which I appear under the format of motions that are identical, passed by every committee immediately following every election, that were originally designed by the Prime Minister's office under Stephen Harper to deprive me of rights I otherwise would have to present substantive amendments at report stage. So apologies to take the moment to explain that I'm here under rules that the committee has passed that make a mockery of the notion the committee is the master of its own process, as miraculously identical motions are passed at the same time by all the committees simultaneously, depriving me of rights that I have. So in this case, Mr. Chair, the amendments that I'm bringing forward are exactly what was in Bill C-65, which died on the order paper January 6, 2025. So at one point, at least, the government approved suggestions that were being made through Elections Canada. So, and in testimony before this committee, this in relation to C-25, I did put the question to the Chief Electoral Officer about the recommendations that were previously made and the support of Elections Canada for changes that were previously made. That would have been, if I can add, but I'm not a witness, so I won't say what specific impact it had on my party in the last election, that the C-65 changes died on the order paper. So Amendment Parti Vert 1 is very straightforward. It's saying we do support the measures, the increased integrity measures found in C-25, but we don't want these measures to raise barriers to entry for candidates who are running as independents or candidates from smaller parties, or candidates in small, remote communities. The amendment speaks for itself. It's very straightforward, but it does change the effect is to say 75 signatures on the nomination papers, again, with all the other rules in place, with the witness present, 75 electors from that electoral district. And I'd be, again, given that this was in previous legislation, I hope committee members will see fit to accept this amendment. Thank you.
Mr. Cooper and then Madame Normandin.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I oppose this amendment. 100 signatures is hardly a barrier. We represent approximately 100,000 constituents. The idea that someone seeking to get onto the ballot can't find 100 electors to endorse their candidacy, and that somehow is a barrier to getting on to the ballot is simply not credible. If anything, the threshold ought to be increased. I'm not proposing that, but if you're going to adjust the number, I would suggest you'd probably want to move it upwards, not downwards. And I would also note that with respect to ridings that are remote, rural, and northern, that the Canada Elections Act already takes that into account, or Parliament has taken that into account in fashioning Schedule 3 ridings where the signature requirement is only 50 electors.
Thank you so much. Madame Normandin.
Oui, merci. J'aimerais m'exprimer en soutien de...
I support the amendment. In discussions that we had at PROC regarding the longest ballot, there was an interest in limiting to one signature per voter. This can be a challenge where people are more remote. So I think that this is very reasonable, especially given potential amendments that are coming in the next hours on the bill.
Madame Kayabaga.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to say that I agree with my colleague opposite on this amendment. On this clause, sorry.
No problem. Any further debate? Seeing one, since there does seem to be some division, can we call the vote, please?
Vote on PV1. Madame Brière.
Contre.
Madame Fancy. Mr. Genereux.
Against.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Contre.
Mr. Lewis.
Against.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Against.
Mr. Calkins.
Against.
Mr. Cooper.
Against.
Mr. Jackson.
Against.
Mr. Cram.
Against.
Madame Normandin. Yeas pour 1, nays contre 10.
Does not carry. We'll proceed to Green Party 2.
Merci, Mr.
Madame.
President. In presenting this amendment, this is again consistent with what was in C65. We do want to improve the fairness and administrative efficiency by giving the nomination window being larger than what is in the current bill. Just to reflect again, and I can't, under the terms of the motion that was put forward, enter into debate, so I didn't respond to the, I wasn't under those terms allowed to enter into discussion as to why it can be more difficult to collect 100 signatures in 2026 than it was in 1990. What we discovered is that electors are extremely reticent and skeptical of why they should provide information to a stranger on the street in ways that in 2025, 2026 weren't the same as in 2019. There's a large degree of resistance to providing personal information, explaining to someone on the street why you want their name, why this is, and that this is not a scam. There's a lot more resistance and hostility in our current climate. To the point that volunteers were refusing to go back out because they'd been harassed on the street for asking for information. So it matters, particularly in a snap election, to be able to collect the signatures. So this amendment, which is again was in the framework of Bill C, was in Bill C65, we want to create the opportunity to start earlier because it takes longer than it used to collect the signatures. You can run into a rainy day. We had electoral officers refusing signatures because they were smeared in the rain when you brought them to the electoral officer, having collected them on the street. People's electoral boundaries have changed, and sometimes they don't recognize the name across the top of the sheet. So just to say, this amendment, Parti Vert 2, is solely to ensure that you start collecting your nomination papers, that they can allow them to be filed from the first day of the pre-election period instead of only in the writ period. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Madame Normandin, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, merci. J'aurais peut-être une question pour
I have
les...
a question for the analysts. I see some advantages beyond those named by Ms. May, but I remember Alain Reyes, after leaving the Conservative caucus, said that if he wanted to be an independent, he would only be able to collect funds once an election was triggered, whereas other parties could start earlier. So I understand how this would help some serious independent candidates who would like to be able to raise some funds, because it is important. But my reservation is that if they want to send their nomination paper to a returning officer, there needs to be a returning officer in that region. There needs to be an office and employees. And so this requires some spending where it might not be necessary. So this is my question for the analysts. Would this require opening a returning officer's offices a few months before an election?
You can collect the signatures at an earlier time, and we wouldn't have to open the returning officer's office earlier if we made this change.
Juste pour être certaine que je comprends bien.
Just to be sure that I understand, the nomination paper could be tabled and received and confirmed by the returning officer, even if there isn't one during the pre-election period?
Under the current act, the returning officer can only accept the nomination paper during the election period, once the notice of election is issued. But the signatures could be collected by the candidate before then.
Merci, mais ça répond quand même pas à ma...
Thank you, but this still doesn't answer my question. Is there an obligation that there needs to be an identified returning officer from the pre-election period versus having ROs only when an election is called. These returning officers are always in place, but you're probably speaking about opening the office of the RO. If you want these nomination papers to be shared before the election period, there would be an obligation to open the offices before the date. Currently, I don't think these offices can be opened early. It's already difficult to open them in the timelines that we have, so it could lead to operational challenges.
Ms. Fancy, please.
Thank you very much, and through you, Chair, we would deem this amendment out of scope for the following reason. Based on the Free and Strong Elections Act, proposing targeted priority amendments to the Canada Elections Act that further protect and secure Canada's elections and respond to expert recommendations like we have here today from the public inquiry into foreign interference, the Chief Electoral Officer, and the Commissioner of Canada Elections. So it is our opinion that this statement falls outside of the scope, so we will be opposing the amendment.
Mr. Calkins.
Just for greater clarity, any prospective candidate could right now go to the Elections Canada website and get the nomination papers and download them and print them, whatever the case might be, and start collecting signatures if he or she chose to. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Is there any reason why, for example, coming into force date for a change of that form that might be problematic for a candidate? For example, if the nomination paper form were to be changed by an amendment to the Act or through some other process or a regulatory change, would that cause any problems, or would if it, let's say it came into force on the first day of the pre-writ period, for example, of a future fixed election date, would that be problematic for candidates, or do you suppose that the old forms would work if people were to collect signatures beforehand, hypothetically? Was I clear in my question?
No, you're clear in your question. I think I'm hesitant to give a response to the hypothetical situation. It's not hypothetical. I understand why it is a question, but I think generally the rule is that if you use a form that is an older form, but the substance of what is required by the Act is there, then you can use that. So insofar as there is, for example, a warning added to the form, and they're using the form that existed before that warning was added, if I'm understanding your question, then presumably that would still be an acceptable form.
Okay. Solution in search of a problem.
Very quickly, Ms. May.
Just to clarify again, that the amendment is about, yes, you can collect ahead, but to make sure the signature is accepted, you have to be able to file it, and the Chief Electoral Officer has to be able to look at it. So the amendment is to that issue again, and I appreciate the clarification that was just brought forward by Blaine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to filing the papers after June 30th, that would mean opening the offices in every riding for the months of July and the months of August in a fixed election year. Could the witnesses give a high-level estimate as to what the cost would be to taxpayers to opening the offices for those extra 2 months?
I'm sorry, I don't think I can give you a high-level estimate, but I think, and sorry, this was my misunderstanding before, there's different ways to file right now. And those would continue. So you can file a nomination paper either online or in person or by email. So I don't think that necessarily the opportunity to file earlier would necessitate opening the office solely for that purpose. Okay. Sorry, I think I was unclear before.
Seeing no further debate, we should call the vote, please.
PV 2, Madame Brière.
Contre.
Ms. Fancy. Mr. Genereux,
Against.
Madame Kayabaga, Mr. Lewis, Ms. Vandenbelt,
Against.
Mr. Calkins,
Against.
Mr. Cooper, Mr. Jackson,
No.
Mr. Cram,
Against.
Madame Normandin. So yeas pour 0, nays contre 11.
Thank you so much. We will now go clause 3. Shall clause 3 carry? Agreed on consent. Clause 3 is carried. We will move to clause 4 with block amendment point 1. Madame Normandin.
Merci. J'en ai fait état.
Thank you. I mentioned this a few times during committee meetings, so I won't speak at length, but having one signature per voter, and I do understand what we're seeking to do, but there are other means to do this, and we can debate it today. There seems to be an imbalance between the advantages and the inconveniences of having a single signature. The chief electoral officer stated that it's difficult to verify whether or not there are multiple signatures, and it would be, there's no real impact with this measure. We're hoping that it becomes a disincentive by putting it, by making it the voter's responsibility versus someone who is encouraging multiple signatures. But it's also going to have an impact on voter secrecy. We're telling people they can only sign one form, and they might feel like they are supporting a candidate even though they might not be. And at the beginning of a campaign, someone might not know who they're going to vote for. And we're not allowing Canadians to sign these 2 nomination papers if they want to see 2 candidates compete. And so this is why we proposed that amendment. Thank you.
I think we should keep this section of the bill. If we remove it, it really defeats, I think, it's inconsistent with the purpose of the bill, which really is to avoid those really long ballots with multiple candidates. I think that if we only go with the official agent, we've seen that that's not enough. And so this is really a way of preventing abuse, so I think we should maintain it.
Mr. Cooper, and then Mr. Calkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand the spirit by which this amendment has been brought forward, but I cannot support it. The purpose of the amendment is to deal with what have been provisions of the Act that have been abused, and one of those sections relates to the collection of signatures by groups like the Longest Ballot Committee that have taken multiple candidate nomination forms, gone to the same pool of 100 electors, and gotten that roughly same pool of 100 electors to sign multiple candidate nomination papers to put on the ballot what amount to being fake candidates. And by fake candidates, I mean people who are not running to get elected. They're not putting forward policy positions. They're not campaigning. They're basically nothing more than a name on the ballot. The purpose of the intent of the Act is that for a candidate to get onto the ballot, the candidate must have the endorsement of 100 electors, not that a group of 100 electors can put on the ballot a seemingly endless list of candidates. Now, with respect to any confusion that electors may have in terms of understanding that with this change that they would only be, under the law, permitted to sign or endorse a single candidate per election, that could be addressed by Elections Canada, by including on the nomination form that you may only sign one nomination. It may sign the papers of one candidate. So, in terms of there being any confusion or misunderstanding, that can easily be addressed. And I take it, based upon testimony from the Chief Electoral Officer and the Minister, that is something that Elections Canada would likely undertake in terms of amending the forms. Should this amendment to the Act be passed? Are there pitfalls to it? Yes, arguably there are, but on balance, I think it is a reasonable amendment and is consistent with the purpose or the intent of the Act, that a candidate must have the endorsement of 100 electors.
Thank you so much. Mr. Calkins.
Thank you, Chair. If this amendment is defeated, we revert to the changes that are in the Act. But I would like some clarity. In a situation where an elector did sign multiple nomination forms for multiple candidates, how would that be adjudicated by the returning officer in that constituency? Would they all be? Would one of the 5 signatures count? Would none of the 5 signatures count? How would that be interpreted?
Under the bill, I assume that's what you're asking, is how would it work under the bill as drafted? A candidate can't be refused on the basis of having multiple signatures, so I don't think any of them would be thrown out in that sense. It would be an offense to sign or to incite people to participate that way, but a person would still become a candidate if they had repeat signatures.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Seeing nothing further, I will test if this can be defeated with division, or if you'd like a vote.
Maybe let's just have a vote.
Let's have a vote? Okay. You can call the vote, please.
BQ 0.1. Madame Brière. Madame Fancy. Mr. Généraux.
Against.
Madame Kayabaga. Mr. Lewis.
Against.
Ms. Vandenbelt.
Against.
Mr. Calkins.
Against.
Mr. Cooper.
Against?
Mr. Jackson.
Nay.
Mr. Cram.
Against.
Mr. Cram.
Against.
Madame Normandin.
Pour.
Yeas pour 1, nays contre 10.
It is not carried. Shall clause 4 carry? Yes, on consent. Clause 4 carries. Shall clause 5 carry? I see nods. Agreed? Agreed. Clause 5 carried. We'll go to a new clause, clause 5.1. We'll start with CPC 1, but a reminder that if, and I don't know if it's been circulated, it has been circulated. If CPC 1 is passed, G 0.1 cannot. Sorry, G 0.1 cannot be moved.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This amendment is a security measure to better strengthen the integrity of the voting process with respect to ensuring that ballot boxes are appropriately secured. Elections Canada does have certain procedures in place, obviously, with respect to chain of custody and how ballot boxes are secured, but I would submit that those rules are simply inadequate to ensure the integrity and security of our elections. At present, a DRO can take home a ballot box from an advanced polling location and store it at their home overnight. Now, yes, the ballot box is sealed and signed, and there's an official transport bag, and there are signatures that are required before the ballot box is sealed and then taken home and then brought back to the polling location and then reopened. However, the idea that DROs are taking ballot boxes with potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of ballots to their homes opens the door to real potential problems. Now, fortunately, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any major incident, but that is not to say that something like that might not arise. We shouldn't react when something happens that causes issues with the integrity of the voting process. We should frankly have the foresight to take measures, preventative measures, and this is one of those measures that I think is eminently reasonable, which is simply to require that ballot boxes be sealed and stored under lock and key at the office of the Chief Electoral Officer, and that there be video surveillance so that there's no question about who has come in contact with that ballot box while it is being stored. If there is any tampering, there would be evidence of that to initiate any prosecution. And I recognize that there are some practical challenges given the geographic size of certain ridings in rural areas and in the north, ridings like Nunavut. This amendment would provide that the Chief Electoral Officer could specify alternative measures. So it's not a one-size-fits-all amendment. It does give the Chief Electoral Officer flexibility where appropriate. But in most ridings, certainly in virtually every urban riding, there is no reason for a DRO to be taking a ballot box back to their home. There is no impediment, no practical impediment as to why they could not simply bring the ballot box to the office of the Chief Electoral Officer, and that the ballot box or boxes be stored under lock and key with a surveillance camera. So yes, it may not be practical in all 342 ridings, but in the vast majority of ridings, it is quite logistically possible, and it provides the Chief Electoral Officer to make certain exceptions where appropriate. But the integrity of the voting process is paramount, and in order to ensure that that process is carried out, not only must the process be carried out with full integrity, but there must be also public confidence in that process. And this amendment, I believe, will help safeguard our elections and also enhance confidence, public confidence, that our elections are being administered in a way that ensures that every ballot is counted, and to guard against any sort of abuse or tampering with ballots. And not only that, but just the, even in good faith, the idea that DROs are carrying around ballot boxes and where are they storing them, for example, in their home, etc. I mean, in a G7 democracy, that just doesn't seem to be up to the level that I think most Canadians would expect in terms of how their ballots that they cast when they go out and vote are being secured.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cooper. We'll go to Mr. Genereux and then to Madame Normandin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think you raised it right before this amendment that there's G1, or sorry, G, I want to get this right, G-0.1 that is coming. I know there's been discussions with those on the other side. I want to stress before stating position on this, that the principle and the spirit of what Mr. Cooper was saying definitely don't disagree with. I think there's just an alternative approach that we'll be providing. So we'll be voting against this particular amendment.
Thank you so much. Madame Normandin, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. De la même façon, je peux.
Thank you. I'm also not against the principle, but I wonder what the relevance would be of having such precise details with video surveillance, for example. We don't review the legislation every year. This technology could become obsolete very quickly, and we'd have to amend the legislation again. And so given that context, I wonder what the relevance would be by having this be a clause in the legislation. And so I would rather vote against. Thank you.
Further, we'll call the vote.
CPC 1, Madame Brière. Miss Fancy. Mr. Genereux.
Against.
Madame Kayabaga. Mr. Lewis. Madame Vandenbelt.
Against.
Mr. Calkins. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Jackson.
Yay.
Mr. Cram.
In favor.
Madame Normandin.
Non.
Yeas pour 4, nays contre 7.
The amendment does not carry. We'll move on to block 0.2, Madame Normandin.
Oui, merci. Ça fait.
Thank you. This follows a recommendation made by the Chief Electoral Officer. He talked about Alberta, where there was a leak or a data leak regarding addresses of women who were victims of violence. Their addresses and their information were made public. This amendment speaks to what the CEO had mentioned to us. So regarding removing one's name from the list in order to protect their safety.
Madame Brière.
Ms. Brière. Thank you, Chair. I do understand what my colleague is saying, but this amendment doesn't propose any circumstances whereby one could ask to be removed from the list, and so we won't be able to support it. Voters can already request being removed from the voter list, which we believe has more impact.
Seeing no further debate, we'll call the vote, please.
BQ 0.2, Madame Brière.
Contre.
Miss Fancy. Mr. Genereux.
Against.
Madame Kayabaga. Mr. Lewis. Ms. Vandenbelt.
Against.
Mr. Calkins. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Jackson.
Contre.
Mr. Cram.
Against.
Madame Normandin.
Pour.
Yeas pour 1, nays contre 10.
Merci. We will now turn to BQ1, Madame Normandin.
Donc, peut-être un commentaire général sur.
A more general comment on this amendment and on the following amendments that are looking at the same topic. So the vouching, somebody responding in somebody else's name. There are more and more ways to identify oneself. We no longer need to have wallets that are full of cards. We want to prevent voter fraud, and so being able to vouch for someone and their residence, and especially given the context where a single vote could make a difference in a riding, I think that this amendment and others are seeking to invalidate vouching in order to confirm their identity or their place of residence.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis.
I appreciate the
the amendment. However, I don't remember having that discussion. I believe this is outside of the scope of what we're doing here for this bill, and this isn't the place to have that discussion, but there might be others. So I will be voting against this.
Okay. Seeing nothing. Oh, yes, Mr. Jackson.
Thank you. This is maybe a question for Madame Normandin, but just to clarify, this amendment removes the ability of an elector to vote after being vouched for at a polling station? So you can no longer vouch for someone at a polling station?
En fait, cet amendement-là, ainsi que
This amendment and other amendments seek to remove the option to vouch for someone in order to allow them to vote. So somebody who shows up without ID, generally somebody can vouch for them. This is what we're hoping to remove through this amendment and through other amendments.
I would vote in favor of it, yeah.
Okay. Seeing nothing further, we'll call the vote.
BQ1, Madame Brière.
Contre.
Miss Fancy. Mr. Genereux. Madame Kayabaga.
Against.
Contre.
Mr. Lewis. Miss Vandenbeld.
Against.
Mr. Calkins.
In favor.
Mr. Cooper.
In favor.
Mr. Jackson.
Yes.
Mr. Cram.
In favor.
Madame Normandin.
Pour.
Yeas pour 5, nays contre 6.
It is not carried. We'll now go to BQ2. Madame Normandin.
De la même façon, comme c'est en fait tous les
Up to BQ 7, or rather 11, these are amendments regarding vouching for someone's identity or their address. This is found multiple times throughout the legislation, so we needed to make different amendments, and they're all linked to vouching. So I won't explain all of them. This is what they're all about.
We could ask for UC to apply the vote from BQ1. Or she could just not.
Defeat on
Monsieur le Président, peut-être pour des fins de rapidité.
Chair, perhaps I'll just remove all of these amendments so we don't have to vote on all of them and we can move on more quickly.
It's not moved. Okay. And so. Was that one or was it multiple?
BQ2 to. So that brings.
We'll now go to G.01, or sorry, 0.1.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's Madame Kayabaga. It's a new one. It has been distributed to the members in both paper and electronic
Where is
format.
it on this page?
It's brand new.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. So it's
Can we
right
pause for a
after BQ 11.
No,
No, she's
GQ
just
11.
removed all of
Sorry,
them.
no. This is the.
Can we pause, Chair, just to kind of get, because I think you just removed
Sure.
some amendments.
This is a good time probably
Yeah.
for a break for everyone. We'll take 5 minutes.
Thank you.
As soon as I went to hit send, it just.
Madame Kayabaga for G 0.1.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to move this bill, that Bill C-25 amended by adding line 2 on page 3 with the following. 5.1 subsection 175.5 of the Act is replaced by the following. 4.1, the candidates or their representatives may, when an advanced polling station closes on each of the 4 days of advanced polling, sign the seal on any ballot box that was used on that day. 5, until the counting of all the ballots on polling day, an election officer shall keep the sealed ballot box or boxes in their custody in accordance with the Chief Electoral Officer's instructions. The election officer shall A, take every precaution to ensure that safekeeping of the sealed ballot box, apologies, I'll reread that. Take every precaution to ensure that the safekeeping of the sealed ballot box or boxes and to prevent any person from having unlawful access to the box or boxes, and B, if they deliver the custody of the sealed ballot box or boxes into custody of another election officer, make a record that they have done so and ensure that the candidates are notified in writing. And I think it ends there.
Thank you so much. Is there any debate? Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've just asked the officials perhaps to provide their analysis on the impact that this amendment would have in terms of how ballot boxes are sealed compared to today.
In terms of how they're sealed, I don't think it would be different, except that this would be in legislation, and whereas right now it is in the Chief Electoral Officer's instructions.
So this amendment, if I'm to understand it correctly, is codifying the current instructions of Chief Electoral Officer to DROs.
And I don't have it in front of me, but based on what I understand, that certainly that element is codifying it, yes.
Seeing no further debate, shall G 0.1 carry? Yes. Vote? Yeah, call the vote, please.
Madame Brière. Ms. Fancy? Yes. Mr. Genereux?
Support.
Madame Kayabaga?
For.
Mr. Lewis?
For.
Ms. Vandenbeld?
In favor.
Mr. Calkins? Mr. Cooper? Mr. Jackson?
Yes.
Mr. Cram?
In favor.
Madame Normandin? Yeas pour 11, nays contre 0.
Carries. There are no amendments proposed for clauses 6 to 18. Is there unanimous consent to group these clauses for a vote? Okay, so there is not unanimous consent. Shall clause 6 carry? Yes, agreed, carried. Shall clause 7 carry? Agreed. I'll just pause for a moment because my understanding was that block 8 was withdrawn. Or do you wish to move BQ 8? Okay. So, shall clause 8 carry? Shall clause 9 carry? And there were further amendments there that I don't believe are being moved, so shall clause 10 carry? Agreed. Clause 11. Agreed. Clause 12. Agreed. Clause 13. Clause 14. Sorry.
That's okay.
Clause 15. Clause 16. Agreed. Clause 17. Carried. Clause 18. Carried. Clause 19. CPC 2. Mr. Cooper.
Just
Take your time.
So this amendment relates specifically to the pre-election period. There's another amendment, the next one, that would deal with the election period that is otherwise the same. In short, what this amendment would do for the pre-election period, and then the subsequent amendment that is identical other than that it covers the election period, would be to require third parties to set up a separate bank account for the purpose of engaging in regulated activities in which monies to that bank account could only come from individual Canadians. This bill, unamended in its current form, does go some way to close existing loopholes that exist, that have been taken advantage of by foreign actors, foreign governments, and registered third parties who have colluded with foreign interests to take foreign money that is then used to influence Canadians at election time. And this is not a hypothetical. It is well documented. Indeed, I wrote to the Commissioner of Elections Canada back in 2017, wherein I highlighted a substantial amount of money, millions of dollars, that had been funneled from the United States, from the Tides Foundation based in San Francisco, to a registered third party that then funneled the money into other third parties that then used those funds in the 2015 election campaign against the Harper government and Conservative candidates. Now, because of the Elections Act at the time, the Commissioner wrote back to me and indicated that there had not been a contravention of the Act. I think most Canadians would have been shocked to learn that millions of dollars of money from the Tides Foundation of the United States could be used by third parties to influence their vote. But that is what the Canada Elections Act provided for. Now, the Liberals did bring in legislation bill in 2018 that made a number of amendments to the Canada Elections Act. Those amendments did close some of the loopholes that existed with respect to foreign funding of third parties, but there remain loopholes. Now, this bill, in light of concerns that have been ongoing about these loopholes, goes, as I noted, a long way to closing them by requiring third parties to set up a separate bank account in which contributions could only come from individual Canadians. But the problem is that it doesn't go all the way. It leaves an exception whereby third parties would be exempted, whereby third parties could use their own funds if contributions amount to 10% or less of their annual revenue in the year prior to the fixed election year. And so this is problematic from the standpoint of foreign money continuing to be used by third parties in a number of ways. I mean, first of all, given that we are in a fixed election period. Oftentimes, we could be in one now. Anytime there's a majority government, that usually is the case. It's very easy for third parties and foreign interests to look at the calendar and anticipate when an election might be. So here you have a situation where a foreign interest could funnel money into a third party 2 or 3 years ahead of schedule. And according to the chief electoral officer, those funds, when I asked him what the impact of that would be, how those funds would be treated, he said that they would be melded, that they would be treated as part of the funds of that third party, whatever the ultimate source might be. And so what the chief electoral officer in his answer to my question confirmed is that such monies could be foreign money. In other words, it leaves a significant loophole open to be exploited. The other thing I would note is that this idea of 10%, it sounds like a small number, except for the fact that it may not be a small number. There are third parties with very sizable, that have a lot of money. And so what constitutes 10% or less of revenue, of their revenue sources coming from contributions, may in fact be millions and millions of dollars. And so, again, not only is there the issue of foreign money coming in, but you also create what could be an imbalance of sorts, whereby small third parties might have to set up a separate bank account, but very large third parties that have arguably vast or much greater influence by virtue of the resources that they have would be able to get around that and use their own funds. And so I said that the best solution would be simply to have a uniform rule for all third parties whereby they must set up their own separate bank account to engage in regulated activities. Now, it's true that the chief electoral officer did not endorse this position that I've taken. He cited charter issues. And more specifically, the charter issues that he cited were around freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Those are certainly important freedoms that must be respected, for fundamental freedoms under the charter. But I was quite skeptical of his position with respect to there being charter implications, given the fact that the government is already going a long way in terms of requiring third parties to set up a separate bank account, with this exception. I asked a number of witnesses, including Gerald Chippier, who's an esteemed constitutional lawyer, what the charter implications would be for this, and he answered none. There is no authority that would indicate that simply requiring third parties, all third parties, to set up a separate bank account, that would pass constitutional muster. Was Mr. Chippier's position. It was a position of other witnesses, including Professor Turnbull. I didn't ask her specifically about the charter implications of that, but from the standpoint of would this be overly burdensome or would it be reasonable, Professor Turnbull said that it would be reasonable and that it makes sense. So given the very real problem of foreign money, underscored by very real issues of foreign interference by hostile foreign states, taken together underscores the need for a fix. This bill, the government has acknowledged there needs to be a fix, hence
There's a problem.
the changes that have been made in this bill, except for the fact that it's only a partial fix, and in a lot of ways, in seeking to fix what is a real problem, to the degree that certain loopholes have been closed, other loopholes have been created that will inevitably be exploited. And given the argument put forward by the chief electoral officer around charter implications, I would submit they're just not that strong. And given the lack of any authority to indicate that this would be offside from a charter standpoint, and given the real problems around foreign money and foreign interference, I would submit that we ought to have one standard, consistent rule. It makes sense. It's not overly burdensome. Everyone plays by the same rules from the standpoint of Elections Canada in terms of filing and ensuring compliance. It also makes it a lot more simpler from that standpoint. So for those reasons, I would urge the committee to support this amendment.
Thank you so much. Ms. Fancy.
Yeah, I'd like to thank my colleague for his testimony today in regards to his amendment. I would like to read into record our opposition to this amendment for two particular reasons. As we've heard from numerous witnesses, we feel that there would be a significant charter risk in doing this amendment. As when you were here, the CEO said in his appearance before our committee, and in addition to others, that we'd like to just take a moment to quote Dr. Holly Ann Garnett, who was here, who had said that I believe it to be an entirely reasonable balance between the principles of freedom of debate and freedom from foreign interference for a few practical reasons, and these were her two reasons. Firstly, that not all third parties are contribution-based organizations. They must use member dues or revenues of a corporation. Thus, the 10% rule seeks to ensure that these types of third parties are not pushed out of the electoral conversation and can engage in the debate with their own revenues. And secondly, part of her quote, that third parties do not register until the pre-electoral or electoral period in the current regime. So since elections can take place at largely any point in Canada, third parties must be allowed some form of flexibility to use their own funds in engaging in the electoral debate. So given the testimony quote from our witness, we will not be supporting CPC 2 in the relation or the other related amendments, CPC 3 or CPC 4. But I'd like to thank my colleague for his testimony today.
Thank you so much. Mr. Jackson.
Well, thank you, Chair. Just very pleased to put a few words on the record today about this amendment. I'm disappointed that the government side has decided not to support it. They're quoting one expert that we heard from at this committee, but there were many others that thought the charter challenge question raised by the chief electoral officer was straining. I think would be the most generous word to describe his argument that this 10% cap should be imposed and not go all the way. Straining to find a reason to keep it is probably being generous in that description. And so for them to use one witness's testimony rather than the number of constitutional experts that we heard from to base their decision to vote down this amendment, it is particularly disappointing. I think when we drive around during elections, Manitobans and Canadians look at signs, not just from political parties and candidates, but from third parties of various different kinds, whether they're pick the type of third-party organization, it doesn't matter. But they've got billboards up, they've got ads on the radio, they've got television ads, maybe if they're particularly wealthy in a third-party organization. As we know, television ads are quite costly in this country. And Manitobans, my constituents, pretty much assume that those ads are paid for by Canadians. I really would struggle to wander around my constituency and find a handful of my constituents that know that those advertisements could have been paid for by people from anywhere else in the world. I think they would find that to be a ludicrous proposition, number one, that that's allowed to begin with, and number two, that somehow it's a Canadian organization's individual charter right to use foreign funds to deliver a politically targeted message. I think it would take me a very long time in the 18,000 square kilometers that I represent to find a Manitoban who thinks that that's an appropriate assessment of the Charter of Rights and Human Freedoms, or Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I think that this is a ludicrous proposition, really, that's being put forward today as to why we need to allow this 10% cap, which my colleague Mr. Cooper rightly points out sounds really small when you mention it as 10% of a donation. Well, if somebody's giving $200 million from a super PAC in the U.S., regardless of their political affiliation, 10% of that is still a lot of money in a Canadian election where we have significantly lower spending caps and donation limits for individuals, Canadian citizens who are donating. And if these funds are donated, again, as Mr. Cooper rightly points out, before the previous year, before the election, which this legislation as it currently exists leaves as a loophole, they're free to do that. And the organization is free to use all of that donation as their own funds and use it for political purposes during the pre-writ or writ period. I would challenge the Liberal members to find constituents who think that that's an appropriate use of foreign dollars to try to persuade Canadians to vote in one direction or another. They shouldn't be coming from the US, they shouldn't be coming from China, they shouldn't be coming from Europe, regardless of the political campaign or policy issue that they're supporting. This money should not be in Canadian elections. I just shouldn't. There's just absolutely no reason for it. And this extremely weak, tenuous charter argument is a ludicrous, in my opinion, justification and use of the charter to defend foreign money in Canadian elections. It shouldn't happen. I'm quite sure that my argument today is not going to persuade Liberal members to change their votes, but I think it's leaving a vast loophole open in our system that we could very quickly and easily solve today that affects all political parties equally. There is not one that benefits more or less from removing foreign funds completely from third parties' ability to fund advertisements during pre-writ and writ period. So there's no reason that we're conservatives, we're trying to get a one-up on the Liberals here, or vice versa. This impacts third parties who campaign on all sides of the political spectrum and for particular niche policy issues. So there's no, I'm finding this very difficult to follow the tenuous, strained argument that the government side is putting forward today. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Mr. Culkins.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And just to reiterate a little bit on what Mr. Jackson has said, it would apply to a large multinational oil and gas company that every bit as much as it would apply to the Tides Foundation or anybody else. So I think the real question is one of integrity. I'm not talking about the integrity of the members here. I'm talking about the integrity of the electoral process and the election. And I think we should be ensuring that integrity to the best of our ability wherever possible, while allowing people who ought to be allowed to be involved in the discussion of an election in Canada, which is frankly Canadian citizens and Canadian voters. And it should only involve financing from those very same interests. And just to read a few things off. Right now, Tides Foundation, as of 2024, is a net assets of $500 million. 2024, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation has assets of $8.5 billion. The Pew Charitable Trust's consolidated total assets are $7.5 billion. Why would we want any of that money in interfering in the Canadian election process if it's not sourced from Canadians. Every bit as much as we wouldn't want money from a large multinational conglomerate doing the same thing. So I think it's a very reasonable, well-intentioned, and frankly patriotic amendment to the legislation, and I would just encourage my colleagues to reconsider their position, given the fact that out of all of the witnesses that we've heard from, we can find far more suggesting that this is a good idea than those who can find a problem with it.
Thank you, Mr. Culkins. Mr. Cooper?
Yeah, I would just add, I'm certainly not trying to belabor this, but I would add a few points. First of all, we regulate political parties. We regulate them extensively. This bill regulates them more with respect to leadership and nomination races, and quite appropriately so. We also regulate third parties. There's a fairly comprehensive regime provided for in the Canada Elections Act. It's not as if anyone can set up a third party and do whatever they want when engaging in what are regulated activities during the pre-election and election period. So in light of that, it seems entirely consistent to provide that third parties, which cannot spend any amount of money, they're limited in terms of how much money they can spend during the election period and the pre-election period, to also say, well, those funds that you're using can only be from individual Canadians. And as a safeguard of ensuring that that is the source of the funds, you're going to set up a separate bank account, and you're going to provide filings that demonstrate that that is where those monies were used for regulated activities. That's what this bill does, except for this big gaping hole. And it would also put third parties, in that sense, in line with political parties, which can only use funds from individual Canadians. And that's been the case now in Canada for more than 20 years. And with respect to the charter arguments, these are sort of arguments in a vacuum. There's been no case authority cited as an example. There's been really no effort made into establishing what precisely the charter arguments against such an amendment, against this type of amendment are, why they wouldn't sustain or pass muster under Section 1, at very least. But I don't even think you'd need to get to Section 1. Now, I would just ask the officials if they have any expectations of how many third parties will be able to avail themselves of the 10% exemption, and if they could give any examples.
I think the answer is that because this is a new requirement, we wouldn't be able to say exactly how many, and I don't have those numbers for you. So, but generally, we would expect that to the extent that there's a third party right now that is a corporation or a union, they would be able to avail themselves of these sorts of exceptions.
And in terms of this 10% figure, why 10%? Why not 8% or 12%? I mean, it seems entirely arbitrary.
Thank you for the 10% is a reasonable percentage. It was recommended by the Chief Electoral Officer. I believe it's also a percentage that's used by Canada Revenue Agency in terms of considering like a 90% overall revenue. There's a 10% sort of leeway. So it's a factor of 10 that's easy to work with also for in terms of the calculation. So there are some practical reasons for the 10%, as well as the commissioner noting that 10% is considered a significant amount in contributions. If it's helpful, I would just note to regarding the proposal in the bill that third parties will not be able to contribute to each other any longer, and that the definition of own funds, if they meet the threshold of 10% or less, excludes contributions of any kind. So own funds refers to the third party's own funds generated in Canada. So as an example, if as a very simple example, if there were donations of $500 that the third party received, and they had $9,000 in own funds, and let's say they receive $500 from a foreign entity or some other U.S. entity or something like that, that's $10,000 overall in revenues that they've received. They have only $500 in donations, so they would meet that threshold of being under the 10%, but they could only use $9,000, like their own funds. They wouldn't be able to use the $500 that came from elsewhere. They're limited to their own funds, and so they would have to then report if they meet that threshold. So the report would provide some transparency as to where those funds come from, given the challenges noted around money being fungible.
What if those contributions were made 3 years before the pre-election period? How would that look from a reporting standpoint?
It could be part of their, maybe it's in their general revenue sort of fund, but they would still need to meet that threshold. Technically, they wouldn't be able to use that, but if they haven't kept track of that, they would have to now under the bill, because this is the rule if they want to participate. But the reporting requirement they would have to demonstrate own funds. So that would be the measure by which, the mechanism by which that would be verified.
They would have to sort of demonstrate own funds. Can you just elaborate on what you mean by that?
So if they meet that threshold and they would like to use their own funds, then they would need to submit a financial statement as part of their reporting.
But the threshold is the year before the election period. So it's not just any year. It's not the aggregate of 4 years. It's the year before. So what about the year before that? There's nothing there, right? I mean, it doesn't deal, the legislation doesn't address that scenario.
It doesn't address that. It could appear as part of their funds, but they would still, if it came 2 years before, let's say, some amount of money, it would show as part of their financial statement. It wasn't revenue generated here. It would have been a contribution of some sort from elsewhere. It's not a perfect regime, as you've noted. It tries to balance the policy objective of keeping foreign funds out of our system with the earlier mentions of charter considerations to allow third parties to participate.
We'll call the vote.
CPC 2, Madame Brière.
Contre.
Miss Fancy? Mr. Genereux?
Against.
Madame Kayabaga?
Contre.
Mr. Lewis?
Against.
Madame Vandenbeld?
Against.
Mr. Calkins?
In favor.
Mr. Cooper? Mr. Jackson?
Yes.
Mr. Cram?
In favor.
Madame Normandin?
Pour.
Yeas pour 5, nays contre 6.
Does not carry. Shall clause 19 carry? Agreed. Shall clause 20 carry? Agreed. Shall clause 21 carry? Agreed. Shall clause 22 carry? Clause 23, CPC 3. Mr. Cooper.
Yeah, well, and this amendment is consistent entirely with the previous amendment, except that it would apply during the election period as opposed to the pre-writ period.
Seeing no debate, we'll call the vote on CPC 3.
Madame Brière.
Contre.
Miss Fancy? No. Mr. Genereux?
Against?
Madame Kayabaga?
Contre.
Mr. Lewis?
Against.
Miss Vandenbelt?
Against.
Mr. Calkins?
In favor.
Mr. Cooper?
In favor.
Mr. Jackson?
In favor.
Mr. Cram?
In favor.
Madame Normandin?
Pour.
Yeas pour 5, nays contre 6.
Does not carry. Shall clause 23 carry? Agreed. Clause 24, go to CPC 4. Mr. Cooper.
Well, I think this amendment, given that the other two were defeated, this follows from if they had been passed. So I'll just withdraw it. Yeah.
Doesn't have to move it. Okay, so we will, shall clause 24 carry? Agreed. Clause 25 carry? Agreed. Potential new clause 25.1, block 12. Madame Normandin.
Merci beaucoup. Le point.
Thank you. This will be relevant for B16 as well. We were disappointed that we didn't see an element in the bill, but we are happy with the openness shown by the minister, which was shared during his speech in the House and when he was here in committee. We were hoping to see, and this is what's presented with BQ 12 and 16, so we wanted to talk about funding in 3 parts. So with B12, we wanted to have a ceiling for a donation by an individual, and that this needs to be considered with 2 other elements that we would have liked to see included. Firstly, abolishing the tax credit to voters when they make a donation, and I had explained it as follows. So if, as an example, I donate $400 to the bloc, I receive a tax return of $300. So through government funding, I am funding the Bloc Québécois, and I'm imposing that the government use government funds to support a political party. And so this really focuses on the pockets of the different donors, and so we need to reestablish a different funding model and eliminate the tax credit and have a quarterly allocation, for example. So for the tax credit, we should have had amendments on the Income Tax Act, which would have been quite lengthy and complex given the current context. Our amendment seeks to establish for public funding for parties So our amendment seeks to establish one of 3 things for public funding for parties that was abolished in the past. And they need to be seen together.
Any further debate? Seeing none, we will go to a vote. If you please call the vote on Block 12.
Madame Brière.
BQ 12.
Oui, BQ 12.
No.
Oui.
Against.
Miss Fancy? No. Mr. Genereux?
Against.
Madame Kayabaga?
Contre.
Mr. Lewis?
Against.
Miss Vandenbeld?
Against.
Mr. Calkins?
Against.
Mr. Cooper?
Against.
Mr. Jackson?
Nay.
Mr. Cram?
Against.
Madame Normandin?
Pour.
Yeas pour 1, nays contre 10.
Does not carry. Shall Clause 26 carry? Agreed. Potential new Clause 26.1, Block BQ 13. Madame Normandin, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, c'est quand même relativement simple.
This is fairly simple. In the new clauses focused on foreign interference, we talk about potential candidates. And to counter foreign interference, we don't need to wait for someone to be an official candidate. A foreign agent could take part in the process much earlier. And so that's why C25 includes the notion of potential candidates. That said, this notion isn't included in the funding aspect. And so it's just to ensure that there's some harmonization here regarding foreign interference to include the potential candidates for funding activities. We had asked the question to the CEO, who agreed. Thank you.
I would oppose this not because we're against it, but because really it's redundant, because Section 477 deems that someone who's a candidate is a candidate the moment that they receive a contribution. So that means that we don't need this amendment, because if you're a potential candidate, you're already captured, and also the word potential candidate could actually create some internal inconsistency in the Act. So I think that this is redundant.
Thank you. Okay. No further debate. I'll call the vote, please.
BQ 13, Madame Brière.
Contre.
Miss Fancy? No. Mr. Genereux?
Against.
Miss Kayabaga?
Contre.
Mr. Lewis?
Against.
Miss Vandenbeld?
Against.
Mr. Calkins?
Against.
Mr. Cooper? Mr. Jackson? No. Mr. Cram? Against. Madame Normandin?
Pour.
Yeas pour 1, nays contre 10.
Does not carry. Shall Clause 27 carry? Agreed. Potential new clause 27.1, CPC 5. Go to Mr. Cooper.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment would specify that information published by the Chief Electoral Officer with respect to a contributor would limit information related to their address and location of the donor, because as it stands right now, anyone who donates $200 or more, if one goes on to the Elections Canada database, they can find out where their postal code is and their name, and that can lead to it being relatively easy, with perhaps some additional pieces of information, to track down donors, and in many instances who could be public officials, cabinet ministers, upper members of parliament. So this is a measure that is aimed at preventing and safeguarding the location of donors, and at the same time ensuring that there continues to be transparency as to who those individuals are and what amounts they donate to candidates or political parties.
Thank you so much. Oh, Mr. Genereux.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just briefly, Elections Canada already currently limits publication to this information, with the exception of providing the full postal code. So we'll be voting against.
no further debate. If we can call the vote on CPC 5, please.
Madame Brière.
Contre.
Ms. Fancy? Mr. Genereux?
Against.
Madame Kayabaga? Mr. Lewis?
Against.
Ms. Vandenbeld? Mr. Calkins? Mr. Cooper?
In favor.
Mr. Jackson?
In favor.
Mr. Cram?
In favor.
Madame Normandin?
Pour.
Yeas pour 5, nays contre 6.
It carries. Or sorry, it does not. It is the opposite. It does not carry. That's. I was doing pretty well until that point in my defense. That's hour 45 minutes. Not bad. We'll go to block 14.
C'est à peu près la même chose que je viens de mentionner pour la.
A similar thing that I just mentioned regarding the addition of potential candidate.
Que la définition.
I would add that the definition is already complete and it would be redundant to make this change.
We'll call the vote on BQ 14.
Madame Brière?
Contre.
Ms. Fancy? Mr. Genereux?
Against.
Madame Kayabaga?
Contre.
Mr. Lewis?
Against.
Ms. Vandenbeld?
Against.
Mr. Calkins?
Opposed.
Mr. Cooper?
Against.
Mr. Jackson?
Opposed.
Mr. Cram?
Opposed.
Madame Normandin?
Pour.
Yeas pour 1, nays contre 10.
Does not carry. Clause 28, NDP 1. NDP 1 is deemed moved pursuant to the routine motion adopted by the committee on June 10th, 2025. Since NDP 1 is deemed moved, BQ 15 cannot be moved as they are identical. Rules are rules. I'm merely a servant of the committee. But since the NDP aren't there, I open the floor to Madame Normandin. They snuck it in just before you got your amendment in. So.
Merci. Donc, c'est simplement.
Thank you. It's similar to what was identified by my conservative colleagues. So to have better balance between transparency and safety regarding funding activities, regarding the date and time of an activity without including the location. We want to ensure that we have some information regarding a fundraising activity without compromising people's safety.
Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. I think this is a good example of why we look at our election laws and strengthen them on a regular basis, and why Canada is looked at as a country that has a democracy that other countries emulate. The rules have changed, the world has changed, and so I believe that if this amendment passed, it would be a bit of a security risk. The world we live in now, elected officials and others can be targets. So I think that this would be encroaching upon that, and I think there are other things in the bill that still let people know what is happening with fundraisers, but I think this one goes a bit too far.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lewis. Okay, we will call the vote on NDP 1.
Madame Brière?
Oppose.
Miss Fancy? No. Mr. Genereux?
Against.
Madame Kayabaga?
Contre.
Mr. Lewis?
Against.
Miss Vandenbeld? Against. Mr. Calkins?
In favor.
Mr. Cooper?
In favor.
Mr. Jackson?
In favor.
Mr. Cram?
In favor.
Madame Normandin?
Pour.
Yeas pour 5, nays contre 6.
Does not carry. Shall clause 28 carry? Agreed. NDP 2. Any debate on NDP 2? Seeing none, we will call the vote on NDP 2, please.
Madame Brière?
Contre.
Ms. Fancy? Mr. Genereux?
Against.
Madame Kayabaga?
Contre.
Mr. Lewis?
Against.
Ms. Vandenbeld? Mr. Calkins?
In favor.
Mr. Cooper?
In favor.
Mr. Jackson?
Pour.
Mr. Cram?
In favor.
Madame Normandin?
Pour.
Yeas pour 5, nays contre 6.
Does not carry. Shall clause 29 carry? Agreed. Clause 30. Go to NDP 3. Okay. If NDP 3 is adopted, BQ 15.1 cannot be moved due to a line conflict. Madame Normandin?
Oui, j'aurais peut-être besoin d'éclaircissements là-dessus, à savoir.
I might need some information. Would it be possible to align both amendments? Because the text is the same, but for NDP 2, or 3 rather, we're looking at the 5-day report and publishing information online regarding an activity, and we're looking at 30 days after, but we're seeking the same thing. So perhaps the two amendments complement each other, but for procedural reasons, one takes it over the other. So would there be one way to include 384-2 and 3 in the same amendment
Concurrence l'un l'autre.
without them competing?
So you can move a sub-amendment to include those lines for the how it will be impacted. You're free to ask officials how that would happen.
Alors, je proposerai un sous-amendement pour
So I would
inclure.
propose a sub-amendment to include 384-3. So that it'd be 384-2 and 384-3.
And for a minute, please. sub-amendment is in order. Do you wish anything further, Madame Normandin?
Est-ce que je comprends que je peux parler sur le...
So I can speak to the sub-amendment and the amendment at the same time? So we want to ensure that for a party hosting a fundraising activity, but who wouldn't be following the rules regarding publishing this information in the 5 days or submitting a report in the 30 following days, that they would not be able to keep the funds that were raised. They would have to return them to the donors. A witness mentioned that a fine for not filling out this information is often lower than the funds raised. So they could use the funds raised in order to pay the fine and keep the rest. And that would allow them to circumvent the rules.
Some clarification on the sub-amendment, just to, if we, I think there might be some, is there some confusion? Or
I don't know so much confusion. I just want to make sure I clearly understand what I'm voting for, and that is simply that if there's a non-compliance with the reporting requirements under the Act, that the candidate or party who had the fundraising event would have to return the money to donors, because the penalties under the Act are actually not all that significant. So arguably, it would almost, you could actually end up by paying the penalty, there would be some incentive to breaking the law. Yeah.
Cost of doing business.
Cost.
Okay.
Cost of doing business.
Okay. Any, Madame Van de Melde?
With or without the sub-amendment, I just think that this goes against the purpose of the bill. And what Bill C-25 is doing is it would treat all of these as a violation, and that's actually like anything that goes against the regulated fundraising event, that is a violation which is consistent with how other things that are similar in the Act are treated.
Okay, so the vote is on, or sorry, any further, I was too quick. Vote is on the sub-amendment. Call the vote, please.
Madame Brière.
Contre.
Ms. Fancy. Mr. Genereux.
Against.
Madame Kayabaga.
Contre.
Mr. Lewis.
Against.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Against.
Mr. Calkins.
In favor.
Mr. Cooper.
In favor.
Mr. Jackson.
Yes.
Mr. Cram.
In favor.
Madame Normandin.
Oh.
Yeas pour 5, nays contre 6.
It is defeated. We are on the amendment. Anyone wish to speak? Same. Okay, Madame Normandin.
Peut-être juste au risque de me répéter.
I might be repeating myself, but in rejecting this amendment, we're allowing a party to collect money and to pay the fine through fundraised amounts, and I think that that's absolutely nonsensical.
Call the vote on the amendment, please. NDP 3.
Madame Brière.
Contre.
Ms. Fancy.
Sorry?
Ms. NDP 3. Mr. Genereux. Madame
Against.
Kayabaga. That's fine. Mr. Lewis.
Against.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Against.
Mr. Calkins.
In favor.
Mr. Cooper.
Favor.
Mr. Jackson.
Yes.
Mr. Cram.
In favor.
Madame Normandin.
Pour.
Yeas pour 5, nays contre 6.
Does not carry. Because NDP 3 did not pass, block 15.1, if you wish to move it.
I lost track. J'ai perdu le fil. Attendez. Oui. Donc, non, c'est bon, j'ai pas besoin de le...
No, that's fine.
Shall clause 30 carry? Yes. Agreed. Clause 31. Agreed. Clause 32. Agreed. Clause 33. Agreed. Clause 34. Agreed. Clause 35. Potential new clause 35.1, block 16.
J'ai déjà présenté l'argumentaire sur la question.
I've already shared my argument on this, so I won't do it again.
Okay, so Bill C-25 seeks to amend the Canada Elections Act to prohibit the use of certain contributions by political entities and third parties and to provide for new requirements related to the protection of personal information by political parties, amongst other things. The amendment attempts to amend the computation of the allowance fund for a quarter for registered political parties. As House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 4th edition, states in section 16.77, since an amendment may not infringe upon the financial initiative of the Crown, it is admissible if it imposes a charge on the, it is inadmissible if it imposes a charge on the public treasury or if it extends the objects or purposes or relaxes the conditions and qualifications specified in the royal recommendation. In the opinion of the chair, the amendment proposes a new scheme which would impose an additional charge on the public treasury, and I rule the amendment inadmissible.
Et je n'ai pas l'intention d'en appeler de la décision de la
And I'm
présidence.
not going to appeal the decision of the chair.
The vote will be to sustain the. Or you're not. Oh, sorry, not. Sorry. It was very quiet on the translation. I apologize. Okay. Very good. Okay. 16.1. Block 16.1. Excuse.
Oui. Alors, on a eu des témoins, notamment
Eve Gaumont, one of our witnesses, spoke about the importance of protecting Canadians' data. The legislation as written allows federal parties to be exonerated from the implementation of provincial legislation regarding protecting personal information. And the goal here is to ensure that federal parties are subject to provincial rules regarding protecting personal data.
Seeing no further debate, the vote is on block 16.1.
Madame Brière.
Contre.
Ms. Fancy.
No.
Mr. Genereux.
Against.
Madame Kayabaga.
Contre.
Mr. Lewis.
Against.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Against.
Mr. Calkins.
Against.
Mr. Cooper.
Against.
Mr. Jackson.
Against.
Mr. Cram.
Against.
Madame Normandin. Yeas pour 1, nays contre 10.
Block 16.2.
c'est des éléments de concordance en
This is to ensure coherence with there is a gap here, but because the previous amendment was not adopted and because the next few are similar, I'm willing to remove these.
And the same with 16.3. Thank you. Clause 36, CPC. And just before I call CPC 6, we have till 1:10, at which point we will adjourn. We don't have resources beyond that point. So CPC 6, please.
Just give me a minute here.
No problem.
Sorry, I just didn't expect it to come up this quick. I need to. Yeah. Okay, I wanted to pull up the section of the bill before I speak to the amendment, but this relates to the privacy policies that political parties are required to file with Elections Canada. Under the bill, it provides that there's a clause 36J provides that political parties are prohibited, as well as any person or entity, from acting on the party's behalf, including the party's candidates, electoral district associations, officers, agents, employees, volunteers, and representatives from, and this is where the amendment would be, providing false or misleading information to individuals about the purposes for which the party collects personal information. This simply adds the word knowingly, which recognizes that political parties operate often on a volunteer basis, that false or misleading information could be inadvertently or unintentionally provided to someone, and so this would just simply provide that it would apply where such false information is knowingly given.
Ms. Vandenbeld, and then Madame Normandin.
We did hear from the commissioner during testimony that adding knowingly would actually make it really hard to enforce, and it would unduly complicate it, so we're opposed.
Thank you. And Madame Normandin, je m'excuse.
Un peu dans la même veine, je comprends qu'en ajoutant le
Similarly, I understand by adding knowingly is that it needs to be proven that they did knowingly mislead someone. So this adds an additional burden of truth. And if one could see that it was an error made in good faith, well, we simply would not prosecute, and I think this is additional burden that is not necessary.
Did it you, Madame Normandin, we received a notification if the members could be careful as we're all flipping through pages to just be careful. It wasn't you. Just flipping pages near the mic is very loud. Mr. Calkins, I believe, is next.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I don't think this burden of proof is actually that difficult. I think what it does is it protects people who might have not knowingly or unwillingly, or we got lots of volunteers, we got lots of people who are just simply doing their best and acting in good faith. I think the real intent here is to actually go after somebody who's knowingly violating the elections legislation or the regulations. So I don't know what this is a very typical burden of proof everywhere else in Canadian statutory law. I don't know what the problem would be in at least considering it. I think intent matters, and if we're just going to, move away from that philosophical doctrine, I worry about that.
Madame Normandin.
J'ai envie d'ajouter, mais rapidement.
I just would like to add, if someone wants to defend themselves regarding providing misinformation, they can say that they did not do it on purpose, then it needs to be proven that it was not on purpose. If it was done unknowingly by a volunteer, for example, then they would be protected. I feel as though this is adding a burden. We would be making it more difficult to prosecute someone who knowingly provided false information.
Seeing no further debate, I'll call the vote on CPC 6.
Ms. Fancy? Mr. Genereux?
Against.
Ms. Kayabaga?
Contre.
Mr. Lewis?
Opposed.
Ms. Vandenbeld?
Against.
Madame Romanado?
Contre.
Mr. Calkins. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Jackson. Mr. Cram. Madame Normandin.
Non.
Okay, sorry. Yeas pour 4, nays contre 7.
It does not carry, and it being 1:10, this committee stands adjourned.